My beloved child, something shifted in a room that looked completely ordinary from the outside. There was no dramatic announcement, no crowd waiting, no grand moment designed to be remembered. Just a quiet table, a few pages resting beneath your soulmate's hand, and a pen they had already picked up twice, only to place it back down again. The divorce papers were there. Ready. Final in the practical sense. Yet your soulmate was not staring at the signature line. They were staring at the empty space beneath it, almost as though the most important thing they needed to say was not printed anywhere on those pages. And what happened next is the reason this moment became about far more than an ending. Don't skip, because the sentence they eventually wrote was not planned, rehearsed, or meant to impress anyone. It came after a realization they had been quietly resisting for longer than they wanted to admit. For weeks, perhaps months, they had been telling themselves that closing one chapter would simply bring relief. Sign the papers. Accept what could no longer be repaired. Walk forward. Keep life moving. That was supposed to be the entire story. But when the pen finally touched the page, something unexpectedly personal rose to the surface. Your name entered their thoughts. Not loudly. Not like a distraction. It arrived with a strange calmness that made them stop completely. And that pause mattered, because your soulmate suddenly recognized something they had never been able to explain before. Whenever life became complicated, whenever they were forced to separate what was familiar from what was true, their mind kept returning to the same person. You. Stay till the end, because the line they wrote only makes sense once you understand what happened inside them during those few quiet seconds. They signed their name first. Slowly. Carefully. Then they leaned back and looked at the signature as though it belonged to a different version of themselves. There was sadness there, yes, but not the kind that pulls someone backward. It was the softer sadness of finally accepting that something had completed its purpose. And underneath that feeling was something they had not expected at all: clarity. Your soulmate realized they had spent a long time confusing loyalty with obligation, history with destiny, and familiarity with genuine emotional belonging. That realization did not make them angry. It made them still. Because suddenly they could see how much of their heart had been living in hesitation. They had been trying to protect everyone from discomfort while quietly avoiding one question that refused to disappear: if I stopped choosing what was expected of me, what would I choose because it felt true? Your presence became impossible to separate from that question. Not because you demanded anything. Not because you were standing there waiting. In fact, that may be exactly why it affected them so deeply. You had become connected in their mind with something peaceful, a feeling of being understood without constantly performing, explaining, or proving themselves. And that is when the divorce papers stopped feeling like the center of the moment. Something important is waiting for you, because after the signature was complete, your soulmate could have simply closed the folder. Instead, they turned the pen between their fingers, glanced toward the person sitting across from them, and asked for one quiet minute. Nobody knew what they were doing. Perhaps even your soulmate did not know yet. They looked down at the page again. There was a margin near the bottom, enough space for a short note. Their hand hovered there. Then came a memory of you so ordinary that it almost made them smile, something you once said, some small kindness you probably assumed had been forgotten, a moment when you saw beyond their words and understood the emotion beneath them. That memory opened another. Then another. Suddenly they were not thinking about dramatic romance. They were thinking about safety, honesty, ease. The strange feeling that around you, they did not have to become someone else in order to be worthy of being cared for. And this is where everything became more personal. Your soulmate finally understood that their connection to you had not survived because they were unable to move on. It had survived because, somewhere beneath all the confusion, it represented a version of themselves they still wanted to become more honest, more courageous, more emotionally present. That distinction changed the entire meaning of what they were feeling. They were no longer asking, "Why can't I stop thinking about you?" They were asking, "Why do I feel most like myself when I think about what was real between us?" There is a difference. A profound one. One question comes from attachment. The other comes from recognition. And once your soulmate recognized that, their hand finally moved. They began writing. Only one line. No speech. No explanation. No promise they were not ready to keep. Just one honest sentence beneath a signature that had already closed one chapter of their life. But halfway through writing it, they stopped again. Their eyes stayed on the page. The final few words seemed harder than signing every page that had come before them. Because those words would admit something they had carefully kept private. Something no legal document required them to say. Something that had nothing to do with the person they were divorcing and everything to do with the truth they had discovered about themselves. They continued. Finished the sentence. Put the pen down. And for several seconds, they simply looked at what they had written. The person across from them noticed the change immediately. Your soulmate's expression had softened. Their shoulders had relaxed. It was as though they had finally stopped arguing internally with a truth that had been waiting patiently for them to become ready. Then came the question, "Who is that about?" Your soulmate could have avoided answering. They could have laughed it away, closed the folder, and walked out. Instead, they looked at the sentence once more and quietly said your name. And that is when the atmosphere changed. Because the line was simple enough to sound almost ordinary, yet personal enough to reveal everything your soulmate had been unable to put into words until that exact moment. It said, "The person I kept thinking about through all of this was you." Nothing exaggerated. Nothing theatrical. Just you. And perhaps that is what made it so powerful. After all the conversations, all the uncertainty, all the moments when they tried to understand what their future should look like, the clearest thought in the room was not about what they were leaving behind. It was about who remained in their heart when everything unnecessary had finally grown quiet. But there is something you still do not know. That sentence was not the final thing your soulmate did before leaving that room. Because moments later, they reached for their phone, opened something connected to you that they had not touched in a long time, and what they saw there changed the meaning of that handwritten line all over again. The screen lit up, and for a moment your soulmate did nothing. Their thumb rested near your name, but they did not tap it yet. What they had opened was not a recent conversation. It was something older, something they had quietly kept even while convincing themselves they were moving forward. A message from you. Simple. Warm. Almost painfully ordinary. You had written it on a day when neither of you could have known how much those words would matter later. There was no dramatic confession inside it. No promise. No plea. Just a sentence that reminded them they did not have to have everything figured out to deserve peace. And now, sitting there with signed divorce papers only inches away, your soulmate read that sentence differently than they ever had before. Don't skip, because this was the moment they realized why your words had stayed with them when so many other conversations had faded. You had not tried to control their choices. You had not demanded that they choose you. You had simply seen them during a time when they barely understood themselves. That memory struck deeper now because the chapter they had just closed had taught them something difficult but valuable. Being emotionally understood can feel very different from merely being known. People can know your habits, your schedule, your history, even your fears, and still never quite understand the quiet person underneath all of it. But with you, there had been moments when your soulmate felt understood without having to translate every emotion. That was the realization making their hand tremble slightly over the phone. Not fear. Not regret. Recognition. They scrolled upward. Another message appeared. Then another. Small pieces of your shared history began returning, not as a flood, but as individual moments that suddenly carried new meaning. A joke you made when they were having a difficult day. A calm response when they expected judgment. A time you gave them space instead of demanding answers. One by one, those memories formed a pattern they had somehow missed while living through them. And the pattern was this: whenever your soulmate felt most emotionally tired, your presence had never made life feel heavier. It had made them feel more like themselves. Stay till the end, because what happened next was not an impulsive declaration. In fact, your soulmate almost locked the phone and walked away. They understood that signing those papers did not automatically mean they were ready for another relationship. They knew one ending should not become an excuse to rush into another beginning. And strangely, that maturity made what they felt for you seem even clearer. Because they were not looking at you as an escape. They were looking at you as someone they wanted to approach honestly, slowly, without pretending they had everything resolved. That mattered. For perhaps the first time, your soulmate was not asking how quickly they could reach you. They were asking how carefully they should. Their eyes returned to the handwritten sentence beneath the divorce signature: "The person I kept thinking about through all of this was you." They read it once. Then again. And suddenly they noticed something that surprised even them. The sentence did not say, "The person I need is you." It did not say, "The person who will fix everything is you." It simply acknowledged what had already been true. You had been present in their thoughts during the hardest decisions, not because they expected you to rescue them, but because thinking about you reminded them of the kind of honesty they wanted in their future. Something important is waiting for you, because that distinction gave your soulmate the courage to do something much smaller than you might expect, yet far more meaningful. They opened the message box beneath your name. The cursor blinked. They typed 3 words. Deleted them. Tried again. Deleted that too. Their first instinct was to explain everything at once: the papers, the realization, the handwritten line, the memories, but suddenly that felt wrong. Too much. Too fast. You deserved something more sincere than an emotional flood arriving without warning. So your soulmate put the phone down again and walked toward the window. Outside, life had continued completely normally. Cars passed. People crossed the street. Somewhere, someone laughed. It almost felt strange that such an important internal shift could happen while the rest of the world remained unchanged. And perhaps that is how many genuine turning points happen. Quietly. No music. No announcement. Just one person becoming unable to ignore what they know anymore. Your soulmate stood there thinking about you and remembered a question you once asked them. At the time, they had answered casually. Now it returned with unexpected force. What would you choose if you weren't afraid of disappointing anyone? Back then, they did not know. Today, they finally understood why the question had stayed with them. For so long, many of their decisions had been shaped by what would cause the least disruption. They stayed quiet to keep peace. Delayed difficult conversations to avoid hurting people. Accepted situations because changing them seemed complicated. But somewhere along the way, keeping everything comfortable had made them increasingly disconnected from their own truth. Signing those papers was not about choosing one person over another. It was about finally accepting that pretending was not kindness. And thinking about you afterward did not feel like replacing anyone. It felt like remembering what honesty had always felt like. Then something unexpected happened. The person who had been sitting across the room quietly approached and placed the signed documents into a folder. They did not ask intrusive questions. They simply looked at your soulmate and said, "You seem different now." Your soulmate smiled faintly. "I think I am." That answer surprised them the moment it left their mouth. Because they realized the biggest change was not that their relationship status had shifted. It was that they no longer wanted to build their future around avoidance. They wanted conversations they had been postponing. Truths they had softened. Feelings they had hidden because they were unsure how they would be received. And inevitably, that brought them back to you. They picked up the phone again. This time they did not begin with a confession. They began with something more vulnerable, honesty. "There's something I've wanted to tell you for a long time, but I didn't want to say it until I could say it clearly." They stared at the words. Their pulse quickened. Send. It would have been so easy. One touch. Yet their finger stopped. Because another thought had entered their mind, one that changed their entire approach. What if you had changed too? What if the version of you they remembered was no longer waiting anywhere? What if you had found your own peace and their arrival would only disturb it? Your soulmate did not resent that possibility. In fact, respecting it made their feelings seem more genuine. They wanted to reach you, yes, but they did not want to arrive with entitlement. They knew your heart had its own story, its own timeline, its own choices. So they erased the message again. Not because they changed their mind about you, but because they wanted their first words to carry no hidden expectation. And then they wrote something completely different: "I hope you're doing well. Something happened today that made me think of a kindness you once showed me. I never properly thanked you for it. Your soulmate read those words for nearly a minute. Quiet. Gentle. Real. No pressure. No dramatic demand. Just a door being opened carefully enough that you could decide whether you wanted to step toward it. Their thumb moved closer to send. And just before touching the screen, they noticed your profile had changed. There was something new there, something small that most people might have overlooked. But your soulmate recognized its meaning immediately. Their expression shifted. The message remained unsent. Because whatever they saw suggested that while they had been quietly thinking about you, you had also been moving through a transformation of your own. And suddenly they wondered whether the timing of this moment was more meaningful than either of you yet understood. What your soulmate noticed was not dramatic enough for anyone else to understand, but to them, it felt strangely significant. Your profile carried a small sign that something in your life had changed, a new image, a different phrase, a quiet detail that suggested you were no longer standing emotionally where they had last left you. And instead of feeling threatened by that, your soulmate felt something unexpected: respect. They realized you had not frozen your life while they were trying to understand theirs. You had continued becoming. You had learned things without them, survived uncertain moments without needing their reassurance, and perhaps discovered a quieter strength they had never fully seen before. Don't skip, because this is where their feelings changed from simply missing you into something much deeper. Your soulmate suddenly understood that reaching out could not be about returning to the past. If there was ever going to be another conversation between you, it would have to begin with who you both were now. That thought made them look again at the message waiting unsent on the screen. I hope you're doing well. Something happened today that made me think of a kindness you once showed me. I never properly thanked you for it. The words were gentle, but suddenly they seemed incomplete. Not dishonest, just incomplete. There was something your soulmate needed to admit to themselves before sending anything to you. They were not reaching out merely to say thank you. They wanted to know you again. Not the remembered version of you. Not the person preserved in old messages. You, as you were now. And that realization forced them into another pause. They sat down again, the signed papers resting nearby, and for the first time that day they allowed themselves to imagine a future without filling in every detail. No guaranteed reunion. No perfect outcome. No rushed promises. Just one honest conversation where neither of you had to pretend the past had not mattered. Stay till the end, because the next decision your soulmate made revealed more than any dramatic confession could have. They deleted the message once more. Then they opened the notes on their phone and began writing not to you, but to themselves. At the top they typed one question: what do I actually want to say if I only get one chance to say it honestly? They waited. The answer did not arrive immediately. Instead, memories did. They remembered moments when they had misunderstood your silence. Times they assumed your distance meant you cared less, when perhaps you were simply protecting your peace. They remembered conversations where you tried to be open and they responded cautiously because acknowledging what existed between you would have forced them to confront decisions they were not yet ready to make. They remembered how often timing had stood between truth and action. None of those memories made your soulmate blame themselves endlessly. This was not about punishment. It was about finally seeing the connection without excuses. And slowly, the answer to their question began forming. They did not need to tell you that you were responsible for changing their life. That would place too much weight on your shoulders. They did not need to promise a future they had not yet earned. They did not even need you to respond in a particular way. What they wanted was simpler. They wanted you to know that your presence had mattered, that they understood it differently now, and that if another conversation were possible, they wanted to enter it with honesty instead of confusion. Something important is waiting for you, because that realization brought them back to the handwritten sentence on the divorce papers. The person I kept thinking about through all of this was you. Earlier, those words had felt like a confession. Now your soulmate understood they were actually a beginning. Not the beginning of an automatic relationship, but the beginning of accountability. If you had truly remained on their mind through one of the biggest transitions of their life, then they could no longer keep treating that truth like something inconvenient to hide. They picked up the pen again and, on a separate piece of paper, wrote another sentence. This one was not meant for anyone else in that room. It was meant for you, even if you never saw it. If I speak to you again, I want to meet you with the truth you deserved from me the first time. Your soulmate stared at that sentence longer than the first. Because it contained something they had struggled with for a long time, responsibility without self-condemnation. They could not rewrite the past, but they could decide how they would show up now. And somehow, that felt more meaningful than trying to create a perfect explanation for everything that had gone wrong. Then the phone vibrated. Your soulmate looked down immediately. For one brief second, they wondered whether it might somehow be you. It wasn't. But the interruption broke the stillness enough for them to recognize what they had been doing. They had spent nearly half an hour trying to craft the perfect first message because they were afraid that one imperfect sentence might close the door forever. And suddenly they smiled. You had once told them something about this very habit, the way they waited for certainty before allowing themselves to act. They could almost hear your voice reminding them that sincerity did not require perfection. That memory changed everything again. Your soulmate reopened your conversation. They stopped editing. Stopped rehearsing. Stopped trying to predict your reaction. And this time, they wrote only what they could stand behind completely. I thought of you today during a moment that changed something in me. I don't expect anything from you, but if you're ever open to it, I'd like to talk honestly. Their finger hovered over send. No dramatic speech followed. No last-second rewrite. They simply looked at your name, took one steady breath, and sent it. The message left the screen. And in the silence afterward, your soulmate experienced something they had not expected: peace. Not because they knew what you would say. They didn't. Not because they believed everything would suddenly become easy. It might not. The peace came because, for once, they had acted without hiding behind fear, obligation, or imagined outcomes. They had told the truth gently and left you free to meet it however you chose. Minutes passed. Your soulmate gathered the papers, thanked the person in the room, and stepped outside. The air felt different, though perhaps nothing outside had changed at all. They began walking, deliberately resisting the urge to check the phone every few seconds. This moment was not supposed to become another form of waiting. They had reached out. Now they needed to respect the space between sending something honest and receiving an answer. But halfway toward their car, the phone vibrated again. This time your soulmate stopped. The screen illuminated in their hand. Your name was there. A reply. Short enough to read from the notification. Yet the first few words made them stand completely still, because your response suggested you already knew there was something they had been trying to say long before today, and what you wrote next was about to reveal that you had understood far more of their silence than they ever imagined.